Good day to you. Taking my dog for a walk right now. Come on, buddy. His name is Finn. Any idea where I am? Some beautiful houses over there. Beautiful colors. It's overcast. I think it's going to be warmer today. I think the sun's going to come out. There was a sound of a bird there. It was a mourning dove. Have you heard that sound before? It goes whoo 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 whoo. I know it well. I've heard it many times in my life. Yeah, do you know where I am? I'm in a residential area, right? Some cars, houses. We're coming up here to a common area now. If we look to the left, there's the entrance. And we're going to go up to an area now where there's a swimming pool. Yeah, it's a common area where people can come and use inside of a development. Have you figured out where I am yet? I bet some of you have. Here's the swimming pool. Beautiful swimming pool. And next to it is that little grassy hut, also called a palapa. That's a hint for you if you haven't already guessed that I am in Mexico. I'm actually at my wife's and my second home. Yeah, not that we had cash lying around to buy a second home. Don't get me wrong. We actually paid a mortgage on our main home for many years, and then we built up equity and took out a remortgage. You know what that is. That's mortgaging both houses into the same loan. We start all over again. And we've been coming to Mexico since 2007. I just love Mexico. I love the country. I love the culture. I love the people. Yeah, originally I started coming to Mexico because of my research in writing a book called Comparing Media from Around the World. And I was actually hired by the U.S. Embassy in Mexico to give workshops to journalists on how to report news in an objective and fair and unbiased way. And that began a very intimate relationship, or continued an intimate relationship, that I have with Mexico since I was introduced to it as a kid anyhow, living in California and Texas. And my wife and I have been coming here to Mazatlan on the Pacific side of Mexico. It's on the Pacific side, not the Cancun side. This is a city that it has a tourism industry for sure, but it's also a purpose-built city for industry. It's got a big fishing industry. It's got other kinds of industries here in Mazatlan as well. And so I thought it would be appropriate to start class today with this beginning teaser for you, because we're talking about global media today. We're talking about global media. We're really changing course here from what we've talked about in the class so far, and we're taking on now, if it's even possible, which it is not, a sampling of the world's media. We're going to go around the globe, so to speak. And, media don't just grow up in countries without any guidance, without any restrictions, without any vision, without any purpose. No, media, TV, radio, newspaper, they don't just grow up in countries without any of those kinds of limitations. Media grow up in countries because of the philosophy of the people who live in a country, because of the culture of the people, because of the religion in the country or the non-religion, because of the strength of the government, because of the military. Media grow up in a country for lots of different reasons. And in fact, there are lots of different countries in the world. There are 200 countries in the world. And those of you who have traveled, who are in this class, you'll know what I'm talking about when I talk about some of these differences in media content areas that we're going to discuss today. And those of you who have not traveled, you'll know as well, because you're accessing media from around the world on streaming platforms and in other places anyhow. So in order to try and understand how or why certain media forms grow up in some countries and don't grow up in other countries, for example, lots of public service media in Europe, not so many public service media in the US. In order to understand why differences exist, there were some researchers. There were four of them. They were called Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm, and then later they added another fourth person who comes later, but 3 researchers to start, 4 later on. They were at the University of Illinois, and they came up with this work of research, and it was called 4 Theories of the Press. 4 Theories of the Press. The press here, you should understand to mean all media. It was just called the press because at that time it was mostly newspapers were the big media. So 4 theories of media. And these 4 theories are going to help us understand how countries control media and for what reason. Okay, so we'll start off with the very first theory. It's easy to criticize this theory. This theory is very easy to criticize from the standpoint of the year 2022, even though it's a theory that did have legitimacy not only then but now. And that theory is called the authoritarian theory. The authoritarian theory came around in the 1500s. It's the oldest of the theories that we're going to talk about in the 4 theories of the press, the authoritarian theory. And it has its roots in royal societies where there were kings and queens, and later in dictatorships. The basic premise of the authoritarian theory is that media are supposed to be servants of the government, not citizens, servants of the government. Media can be privately owned and they can be profitable, but the objective is not to serve the audience, it's to serve the government. And the government is usually made up of rulers that have some kind of divine inspiration. That means the rulers have a direct connection to a deity, to a god. You see this in Iran, for example. You see this in the Vatican with the connection to the priest and God. And so usually in authoritarian countries, you have a ruler, and now we're going to use that word, a ruler, because that person has a lot of power in authoritarian countries, and that person is connected somehow with a deity. They have special access to that deity. Usually where you see authoritarianism rising up is in countries that are very vulnerable, or at least they perceive themselves to be vulnerable. Vulnerable to enemies, like your next door neighbor you're at war with, like Israel and Palestine, for example. Or vulnerable to disease, like Ethiopia has been subjected to famine. Or subject to natural disasters, like Haiti has been ravaged by hurricanes. And so in these kinds of countries, an authoritarian or iron fist rule is said to be needed in order to stop the countries from failing or falling apart or being susceptible to takeovers from hostile countries. And so that's authoritarianism. You can see authoritarianism perhaps from the vantage point of your parents. Your parents when you were 14 and 15 and setting the rules for when you could come home, telling you who you could hang out with and taking away whatever privileges you might have if you didn't do your homework. And these kinds of things are authoritarian rules. They supposedly have your best interest in mind. They know better than you. That's what is happening in an authoritarian system where media grow up. And we can see authoritarianism not just in countries like Korea or China, but also here in the United States. Authoritarianism is not only the only theory that only operates in one country. For example, after 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers, the U.S. government passed the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act gave the U.S. government the right to wiretap, to tap into your phone every time you make a phone call to anybody in a foreign country. The U.S. government can listen in. That's an example of authoritarianism. Why? Perceived vulnerability to terrorist attacks. All right, so we're going to leave behind the authoritarian theory now. We're going to go into libertarian theory. Libertarian theory is different. Libertarian is actually a reaction to authoritarian theory. It came out in the 1600s and on into the 1700s. It's the theory that probably most closely describes the U.S., and it's basically saying that the media do not belong to the government. The media are a separate institution, and they get to be free from the government. And the reason is that media get to be free from the government is because people are moral, and they can discover and know the difference between truthfulness and falsity. So let the people decide, right? Let there be a free market, in fact. Let there be a free press, and then the free market will be where people decide whether the truth is being told, and if the truth isn't being told according to the people reading the newspapers, they'll not buy the newspapers. So libertarian theory allows for profit making as well. It's not just about freedom from government, and that's the root of that word, right? Liber is free, libertarian is free, freedom. Libertarian theory is freedom from government. it allows also for profit making because of the premises I spoke to you about earlier. Therefore, the role of the media is there are three functions in this libertarian view. The three functions are to inform, to entertain, and to advertise. Advertising being a big part of that profit-making formula for how media will operate. Media being free from government control in a libertarian theory. The weakness of this theory, we kind of implied it with the authoritarian theory, is nobody likes to be under an iron fist rule, but the weakness of the libertarian theory is that profitable voices are heard from and non-profitable voices are not. So people who have something to say but there's no money to be made off of them, they don't find their way into the system. And in fact, the whole influence of commercialism on the media system screens out certain kinds of content. We'll find out later on in the class that's true for the US. We don't get a lot of foreign media coming into our country because of our libertarian ideals. Setting up profit making is not being interested in bringing in foreign content. Now we're going to go on to a third theory. It's called the communist theory. The communist theory, most people will recoil when they hear that term. Oh, communism, same with socialism, and they will automatically dismiss it. That's not the communism we're talking about here. Communism does come from the writings of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, a German, writing in a time period in which factories were abusing their workers. Workers were working 12-hour days in poor lighting, in unsafe conditions, electricity and water in the same area. So, examples like that. So Karl Marx and his co-author, Friedrich Engels, came up with the Communist Manifesto. And the Communist Manifesto, which is their writing, you can call it a book if you want, it basically set up the framework for communist theory. Communist theory, as it's applied to media, says that media are not just a servant of the government, but media are actually owned by the government. They're owned by the government because there's only one valid political philosophy in a communist system, and that is communism. Why else would you have elections if there's only one valid system, communism, there's no need for competition. And in a communist system, again, you have rulers kind of like in an authoritarian system that have the best interests of people in mind. It's so-called, that's what they're operating under. And they are trying to equalize economics amongst people in a communist society. That's some basic principles of the communist philosophy. So media are an instrument of the government. They are an instrument of government designed to be carrying out the government's propaganda. That's actually a term that's used. If you go to China, they have a ministry of propaganda. It's not seen as a bad word. So it's to promote the efforts of the government. The government's out here raising money. The government's out here solving problems. The government's out here building railroads. That's what a communist press does. The press the media, is not a watchdog in a communist system. You're not criticizing government. In fact, you'll be censored in the communist system. When I was in China, also researching for this book that I mentioned earlier, Comparing Media from Around the World, when I was in China, I tried to access Facebook and I could not. It just said web page not available. That's the government censoring Western, in this case, Western media. And so government censorship is very common in a communist system. But for the most part, editors and writers, they just know not to criticize. They don't even risk it. Next up is the social responsibility theory. This is the last of the four theories by Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm. So the social responsibility theory is an outgrowth of libertarian philosophy, but it was not content with libertarian philosophy just allowing media to have no moral compass, so to speak. And so the social responsibility theory tries to address that. It came out in the 1940s. Professor Hutchins who is the lead author on this. Professor Hutchins from the University of Chicago, and his Hutchins Commission that he put together came out with social responsibility theory. And it was mainly concerned with that media are controlled by corporate interests. And because of that, public dialogue can become debased. That, we get a lot of Kardashians. We get a lot of ridiculousness. We get a lot of shows that may be funny, sort of, but they're also crude. And they're just... Are they elevating us? No, not in a communist system, by the way. Part of what the communist system tries to do, sorry to backtrack here, but I got to mention it, is to elevate tastes in media. That's why when you see communist media, you see opera, you see symphonies, you see dance, to elevate tastes, at least high art tastes of the public, and government funds that. In a social responsibility theory, it's also concerned with with the debasing of dialogue, but has a different response than putting money into funding opera. Instead, it says, listen, let's all recognize that media have a privileged position in society, that media can command thousands or millions of people to watch or listen to their content at a moment's notice. Whereas the average person, if you call a press conference, who's coming? Nobody, right? But the media, they can garner immediate thousands and millions of people. So they have a privileged position in society. Therefore, they have a heightened responsibility to society. They must, for example, serve as a watchdog of government, try and make sure that no corruption is taking place. Media must be profitable to avoid outside pressures so that media can sustain themselves financially, not rely on government funding. The media must give the public what it needs for the public to be knowledgeable and to govern itself. And there are other things as well that you can read about in the chapter. And so the government in a social responsibility theory situation is only stepping in when the rules are broken. The government is like a referee in a football game. If there's a penalty, a flag is thrown, the government comes in, fines the party, and then steps back out and lets the competition continue on. All right, we're going to move on now to cover a fifth theory now. This was not part of the original four theories of the press, but has been added later. This one is called developmental theory. It's for countries like Mexico. It's for emerging countries. And by the way, if you use that phrase, third world country, you're showing yourself to be a little bit ignorant. Got to use that word. A third world country, that's a term that was designated during the Cold War when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were in a standoff against each other. And first world countries were all those countries that were aligned with the United States, like Britain, for example. Second world countries were all those countries like Poland that were aligned with Russia, or the Soviet Union at that time. Third world countries were too small and too weak to be aligned with anybody, so they just had to go along with who might win this giant war. So they were third world countries. How condescending, right? We don't refer to countries that way anymore. We call them developing countries, countries that are still trying to build up their infrastructure, still trying to eradicate disease like polio, still trying to feed the people, still trying to have a solid economy that is not susceptible to wild swings in the economic system or hurricanes or whatever. So developmental theory is for countries like Mexico, where the basic premise of it is that government need media and media need the government. Developmental theory says government need the media need the government. They need to rely on each other. There should not be an antagonistic relationship. And so the media needs resources. It needs government funding. It needs training of talent. You don't just put a person behind a news anchor desk. They have to have a journalism background, right? So it takes a lot to produce media content. The government needs to stimulate that. The government needs to approve licenses. The government needs to build infrastructure. You need electricity to run a television station, right? When I was in Ghana, Africa, there were whole villages without electricity. That means no television. You can still have radio, it's easier, but no television and usually no web either. So the government has to help build up media, and then media have to help the government. Don't tear the government down all the time. Help the government. Help the government get word out about hygiene, about medical advances, about education, about new roads being built. Government need the media, media need the government. This will stimulate the economy, raise education, improve health. That's what the idea is in a developmental theory approach. And then finally, we have the democratic participant approach. Democratic participant theory, if you prefer, the sixth and final theory to talk about the press for why do press grow up, why do the media grow up in certain ways in some countries and not in others. So in the democratic participant theory, it came about mostly in the United States because of the internet and because of people jumping on their phones and their laptops and their tablets to create content on social media, on YouTube, which is a social media platform, and in email, and in their own web pages. And so what this one is called democratic participant. It's the idea that everybody, the average person, the ordinary citizen, can participate in the discussions that take place about policy, the national discussions, the way a society and a country conducts itself. The average citizen, not just opinion leaders, not just government officials, the average citizen, because they can jump on their phones. You can create citizen journalism. You can record video that ends up on the news. You can break a story that a journalist has not been able to find out, but you've been able to find out. This is all possible in a democratic participant theory. All right, so now we're going to move on to the sort of the second half of the chapter. Now we're going to talk about going global, and we're going to cover areas of the world. I said it's impossible to do, right? 200 countries in the world, and I mean, how many will you get to see before you pass away, so to speak? I mean, I've seen a lot, but I will probably seen no more than 40 would be my guess. And the world is so big, so vast. It takes 2 full days of flying in an airplane all the way around it to be able to see it. And the biggest language in the world, just as an aside, the language that's spoken the most often is Chinese. It's Mandarin Chinese, but it's just that it's in one region of the world for the most part, China. The second language is Spanish. We're not even at English yet. Spanish is spoken all throughout Latin America. But English has a distinction of being the third biggest language, but on the internet and in media, in those arenas, English is the most prominent language. So let's cover some regions of the world now, starting with Canada, Western Europe, and the UK, really big areas, right? Canada has a free press, so does the UK, but in Canadian media, in Canadian society, you have one difference, and that is there is a protection from US media coming into Canada, because there is a concern that Canadian culture will be overwhelmed by US media. Most of the Canadian population lives along the border of Canada. I have taken my students to Montreal, Canada, and to Toronto, Canada for a class that I teach called Comparative Media. And you can see that there is a definite guard against too many American songs being on the radio. You see that because they have a 35% quota, no more than 35% American music on Canadian radio. So that's one thing that distinguishes Canada. Also, Canada is a really big country. It's the second biggest country in the world. It's bigger than the U.S. And it's got these vast stretches that have hardly any inhabitants. Yet there are still inhabitants. And many of those inhabitants are original people, they're indigenous peoples, as we call them. Eskimos, if you prefer, as some people call some of the indigenous peoples in Canada. And so Canada has a strong public service sector where its public service media are reaching people in the far outlying reaches of Canada. And you can actually listen to a radio program all the way across Canada. It's not local radio. You can listen to it all the way across Canada. And the same goes for television as well. You can see it all across Canada. The program you see in Montreal, you can also see in British Columbia. Let's talk about Western Europe now to branch off of Canada. Western Europe can be described similarly. There is a very strong presence of public service media in Western Europe. So public service media are generally media that are not just about making money, although some public service media do make money and do include advertisements. Other public service media like the BBC World Service from Britain, the British Broadcasting Corporation, that's what that BBC stands for. No commercials are allowed. Generally speaking, public service media are supposed to be serving the public. It's not about selling Nike. It's not about selling news as a product. It's about serving the public. And so you will find in many European countries there is actually something called a license fee. And that is a fee that people have to pay if you own a television set. And that fee is collected and then redistributed by the government to television public broadcasters and radio public broadcasters. So that's how they get their money. They don't need advertising. They don't want advertising. Advertising has its own influences on the content. Instead, content is produced and the content is not always popular. Like I saw a documentary in Britain on television. It was about Alexander the Great. And they had this documentary with an actor in it who walked all the way from Britain all the way to Egypt. Yeah, you heard me right. From Britain to Egypt. Walked all along the Mediterranean, just like Alexander the Great did. Now, that show is going to have very limited appeal. Many people in this class, if they saw it, they probably wouldn't turn it on. But it had to be made if you really want to understand Alexander the Great. So really an amazing example there of how public service media are fulfilling a function that we don't necessarily get in the U.S. We do have PBS, the public broadcasting system. We do have some public service examples, but not quite like that. And that's because of that license fee money that's provided. All right, we're going to move on now to, before we leave, this is mentioned in the book. I don't really want to cover it because it really makes media out to be scary in other countries, but I suppose I should. And you can read about the Danish cartoons in this chapter, and the Danish cartoons, which were reprinted in a Philadelphia newspaper of all places, which were doing
I guess you would call it a satire, although Muslims wouldn't consider it to be a satire, but it was a satirical cartoon about Muslims, and caused a lot of riots and some attacks and some deaths in Britain because of tensions between Christians and Muslims and non-Muslims that was fueled by these cartoons. You can read about that in the chapter. Speaking of Muslims, let's talk about Islamic countries. Now, Islamic countries, mostly in the Middle East. Here, media are heavily controlled by government, and it's the Islamic religion that is dictating how government is itself set up, and the Islamic religion is laid out in the Quran. That's the holy book, and Muhammad is a figure that cannot be depicted visually. That's part of the religion of Islam, at least at least particular sects of Islam, and that's where the Danish cartoons got into trouble, by the way. And so in the Middle East, you have media that are basically servants of religion, of Islam, of the Muslim religion, and people who practice it are Islamic. So it sort of straddles a social responsibility model and an authoritarian model. You're not allowed press freedoms in the Middle East. Certainly female journalists are not allowed freedoms that male journalists are allowed to have in their dress and their attire. And there's a lot of danger in the Middle East. Syria, one of the most dangerous countries in the world to be a reporter in. There is, however, one of the most important objective news networks on television that's broadcast across the world is called Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, A-L, and then Jazeera comes out of a small country called Qatar with a Q. And so that's notable about the Middle East as well. Let's go on now to Africa. I've only been to Ghana, Africa, but what I've seen is very typical, I understand, of Africa being a combination of a developing media philosophy and an authoritarian media philosophy. You have a continent that was colonized, right? It was colonized by Portugal, Holland, the UK, and France for the most part, and now it's kind of being colonized by China, at least as far as I could tell while I was there. But these countries went there originally for the minerals, like Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast for its gold, and now it's Ghana, and then for its slaves, as part of the slave triangle. So Africa shed its colonialism, and now it's trying to reassert its own national identities, and you can find a lot of media content. I did when I was in Ghana that's creating traditional African media content to make sure that African culture is reasserted. So, for example, the dress of the anchors was nothing like the anchors that we see in the suit and tie and jacket. Now, that's a Western way of dressing. They were in very colorful gold-lined African gowns in order to preserve African culture. In Africa, because so much of it is comprised of villages which only have oral languages, did you get that? Only oral languages, no written language. Because of that, in many parts of Africa, radio is the most important, because you simply can't have a newspaper. You can't read a newspaper if you don't have a written language. And the web is no good in many ways either, unless you're just going to use it for graphics. Let's go on to the Soviet Union now. Russia and the former Soviet republics, and the scale of this country, Russia, just makes it almost impossible to develop national media and to have a national media strategy. I mean, they have 11 time zones in Russia. That's incredible. We have 4 in the United States. How do you program the nightly news at 6:30 at night when it's 6:30 in the morning in another part of the country? I don't know how you do that. The country used to be under communist rule, and then it went through a reform period, but now it's still under an authoritarian rule with Vladimir Putin, and most of the Russian media are owned by the government of Russia. They have like a business stake, and they're stockholders in the Russian media. 3 out of 4 television stations, I think it is. And if you are a critic of the Russian government, you might find yourself going missing or being poisoned or being put on trial under bogus charges. So the press is theoretically free in Russia, but it's not because of the financial and the political interests there. Moving on to Asia now, there are many countries and cultures in Asia. It's really impossible to characterize them by calling them Asia. We'll focus on 3, India, China, and Japan. Those are the biggest media producers. Most media in Asia are either government-controlled or they are run by public corporations. And they do follow a developmental philosophy because many countries in Asia do perceive themselves to be vulnerable. The only one that I've been to is China. And I did see a great example of a developmental media strategy there when I was in my dorm room, and I would hear the lady, as I thought of her every morning, saying, hee, ha, hoo, ha, hee, ha, hoo, ha. I said, what is that? I got to find that out. It sounds to me like a military march. Sounds like China's preparing itself for a military action. And so I went to the front desk. I asked them, and they said, oh, no, that's the exercise lady. The exercise lady. Yeah, what China did was it put little speakers in the ground, loudspeakers, to broadcast the exercise lady every morning to get people in the mood to do sit-ups, push-ups, and exercise and get fit. And that's a developmental media philosophy right there. In India, newspapers are the biggest of the media. And India is just crazy about newspapers. It used to be occupied by the British for 300 years, so they're very much, English is very much spoken there. English newspapers, very, very much big there. It's the world's largest democracy. India, it is. But journalists are allowed to be imprisoned. The law allows that for criticizing government. Moving over to China now, I've already said a few things about China, but it also ranks 176 out of 180. 176 out of 180 for press freedom. It's like fourth from the bottom as far as press freedom. Like I said, I had no access to Facebook. Journalists there, they have to have their stories cleared. Many of them just don't print anything that's critical of the government because they know it will be censored. Japan is the third country, very different. Japan is probably the closest country of all the countries in the world to the United States because it's a very capitalistic, very business-oriented, very profit-oriented country when it comes to its media system. And technology is at the heart of Japan. We think of it as the technological heart of the world with Sony, for example. Much of the world's electronics come from Japan. The reason it's so close to the U.S. is because after the World War II, the United States set up its economy under General MacArthur. So there's always this close association between Japan and the U.S. when it comes to their economies and media products, really. The most important content to come out of Japan as far as the rest of the world is concerned is manga or Japanese anime or Pokemon, if you want to think of it in terms of a specific example, that style of media content. And now finally we finish up with the United States, the USA, United States, and what we want to remark about the United States is it is very similar to China, very similar to China in this respect. In the United States, you will find very few imports from foreign countries, not because they are prohibited. In China, you will find very few foreign imports from other countries, especially the United States, because they are prohibited. They are prohibited in China. They are not prohibited in the United States. So why do you have the same end result? Where in both countries, they're very insular. Both countries have hardly any outside foreign media content. One is because in the United States, the commercial interests prevent that. NBC, CBS, Disney, you name it, they're not interested in foreign competition in the United States. And so the cable systems, the satellite systems, they really downplay choices of foreign content. You got to go searching for it. It's way up, high up in the channel selection. Most of the programming, most of the content you get is American. In China, it's because they don't want the vileness of Western content. They don't want prostitution. They don't want drugs. They don't want infidelity. They don't want crass language coming into the country, so they censor it. The end result is both countries are insular, but for very different reasons. And that is going to take us a little bit longer than our normal amount of time, but that's going to wrap up global media after all. We were talking about the world. Have a great day.